So my name is Charles Colton, Captain Charles Colton, and I was born back in 1724. So I want to tell you some stories about my younger days, but not so young days. I want to talk to you about the time of the war for our independence, for American freedom, what we call the War of the Revolution. Well, I wasn't some 17 or 18-year-old full of vinegar and wanting to have adventure. I was 51 years old when the war started. And I was a member of Colonel Ruggles Woodbridge's regiment. And you might know Colonel Woodbridge. He owns a tavern in South Hadley. And he's a doctor, but he also has a distillery. And I think that might have had a little something to do with how he got to be a colonel, but don't tell him I said that. I am a captain of one of the companies within his regiment. And his regiment had 8 companies, and each one had a captain. My company had between 75 and 80 men, depending on exactly what week you're looking at because of illness and expiration of enlistment and so forth. But when we heard about the kerfuffle in April of '75 down in Concord and Lexington, the colonel called all of the members of his regiment up, and we marched towards Boston. And we took up our positions just outside of Boston so that we could keep an eye on the troops that were stationed there. Now, since we're a militia company or a militia regiment, we all wore just our regular clothes. There's no uniforms for us to wear. So this is my second best clothing that I'd be wearing. And all you men probably know, since being in the militia, you had to be a member between the ages of 16 and 67. So you're all familiar with militia service. But I'm wearing my sash, which is my badge of office, along with my sword. And my sash is silk, and it's about 9 feet long. And you can stretch it out, and supposedly I'm told that it could be used as a stretcher to bring me off the battlefield if I'm wounded. But I wear it, as the other officers do, as a badge of office. Well, while we were stationed outside of Boston, many of the officers talked to General Washington. Washington had been brought in to take command of all the troops that were located there. And they decided that we needed to harass the British troops, the regular troops that were stationed in the city. So a small select group of men were taken over the neck into Charlestown, and they dug entrenchments overlooking Boston. And the original order was that they were to dig in the raised area of Bunker Hill. But what they found when they got there was Breed's Hill was actually higher and gave a better view of what was going on down in the city. So they dug a number of entrenchments and created a fortification on the heights overlooking the regular troops. Now, the general who was in charge of the royal troops there received a little bit of pushback from his officers that were working with him, because he had decided to abandon Charlestown because he said nothing would ever happen there. Well, turned out he was wrong. So when the sun rose and they saw all of the colonials entrenched on Breed's Hill, they decided they needed to do something about that. So they took some whaleboats, some longboats from the docks in Boston. They rowed over a couple of thousand regular troops, including grenadiers, and they attacked the fortifications on Breed's Hill. And they were repulsed. The troops had to retreat, and we colonials stayed on the top. And they sent another wave of men, and they were defeated, and they had to withdraw. And finally, with reinforcements coming over from Boston, they sent a third wave. And that's where I come in with Colonel Woodbridge. Colonel Woodbridge and myself and the other captains, we were over on the other side of the neck leading into Charlestown, and we were called for to reinforce the troops that were in the heights. So we came over that neck, and as we came over the neck, we were bombarded by the Royal Navy, cannon fire into them. And just as we were getting past that narrowest area, an officer on horseback caught up to us, and they said that they were about to be overrun on Breeds Hill and Bunker Hill, and we needed to reinforce them as fast as we could. Well, everybody started off at a run. That's not what you do if you want to keep command and control. So everyone arrived kind of in a ragtag order, but we got there in time to reinforce the troops who had completely run out of ammunition, and they were fighting hand to hand with the British. And as they retreated, we covered their retreat so that they could get out, and the British did overwhelm both Breeds Hill and Bunker Hill. So the King's troops did win, but we lost 400 men and they lost 1,200 men. So they won, but they won at a very, very heavy price, and they realized that the colonial troops were not going to be a pushover that they thought they would be. Well, very soon after that, the 4th Hampshire Regiment was rolled in to be part of the colonial army, the forces under the command of the legislature in Philadelphia and the command of George Washington, and we stopped being the Hampshire Regiment and we became the 25th Continental Line of Foot. We were an infantry regiment. So there were uniforms that were issued. One of the things that I think is very noteworthy is on some of the buttons, they actually say USA, United States of America. So we weren't just Massachusetts militia anymore. We were part of something much bigger than that. I was involved in several other incidents. One that I'll bring to your attention because it might be at some place you might have heard of, Fort Ticonderoga. Well, Fort Ticonderoga back in May of 1775, had been taken over by the Green Mountain Boys, Ethan Allen, and the support troops that went along with them. It was a very small garrison of men at Fort Ticonderoga. Well, they took over Ticonderoga, and then in the winter of 76, General Knox brought cannon down to Roxbury, Massachusetts, and that was one of the reasons why the Royal troops and Navy had to leave Boston. Well, once the Royal troops left Boston, another strategy came to the minds of the colonial officers and George Washington. They thought that we needed to get more reinforcements from beyond just New England, and we might have allies up in Canada. We had allies in the French-speaking part of Canada, and we could have made them the 14th colony because they had no love for the British because the British had thrown the French farmers out back in the 1740s, around the time I was born. Well, a gentleman by the name of Benedict Arnold, some of you might have heard of him. He was in command of troops that went from Boston up through the District of Maine, up into Canada. The fighting did not go well for the troops up there, and the Royal forces defeated them, and they started coming back down through New York State. Well, we were called up, the 25th Regiment, 25th of Foot, to go up through New York, through the District of New York, that's the Vermont area, and we occupied Fort Ticonderoga and received the troops as they retreated and reinforced them, just as we had reinforced the troops at Bunker and Breeds Hill. I stayed up in Ticonderoga for about a year or so, and then in 78, I became classified as supernumerary. Many of you may not know what that is, but that meant that I got to keep my rank as a captain, but I no longer had a company that I was in charge of. I would be brought up when there was a need for my services. I would be called up for special assignments. And I kept my rank to the end of the war, came back to my home in the Long Meadow. I lived in the Outer Commons in what's the Long Meadow. And I died when I was in my early 80s. And here I am today. So as I said, it's something that's maybe a young man's tale, but I wasn't that young when it happened to me. So thank you very much, everybody.